Shane Elliott, great to have you with us during this lockdown to talk all things hurling and your career, your life, and everything else. But when I always think Shane Elliott or Elliott's or McMullins, I think Dunloy. And I was up there, obviously, many years ago. I remember doing a feature when someone had the jerseys and the boots out in the line, and we did shots of them overlooking Dunloy and all that. And
Yeah,
it was an
yeah.
incredible time, an incredible club. It always stuck with me. And I've some video here. I'm going to actually try to play, and I haven't done this before on Zoom, and I'm going to try it today anyway because I found some video last night I was looking through. Now it's not from that far back, but it's Dunloy winning the Antrim Championship in Casement about 10 years ago. So I'm going to try and share it with you here, and we'll maybe just talk over it. Can you see that okay?
Yeah, I can. I can see it clearly, yeah.
All right, well, talk me through it. The old Casement.
It sort of brings back Casement, probably my favourite ground of all time, actually. Many people would say that. Do you know what year this is?
I think it's 2011 or 2010, maybe.
If we won it, I actually think it's 2009.
Oh, you're right. You're right.
And
you're right.
I was co-managed
there.
I co-managed that team with Gary O'Kane. Me and Gary were in charge of that team. And that's one of the, well, we'll talk about him later. Alistair, probably one of the greatest forwards ever to come out of Ulster in Ireland, actually. But I think that's 2009.
Goalkeeper scoring there as well.
Yeah. And that was Gareth McGee, who took over from me after I retired. That's Gareth, Gareth was a great young keeper. But that brings back great memories. I've never seen that footage, actually.
Yeah, well, I sort of kept it, and I'd had it all this time, and I'd forgotten myself that I even had it, Shane. But look at the celebrations here, and what I love about this, look at the kids on the pitch as well. Yeah. I mean, those boys and girls must be, what, about 15 now?
They would be now, yeah. That brings back really good memories. And Mickey was a great cornerback, great captain for us, actually, great leader. Still, he was involved with our senior team coaching. You know, these things all move through. Mickey's still very actively involved in the underage scene in the club. That's actually great to see. Never seen that. That's Father Brankin, who would have been a former parish priest. Darren Quinn just behind him there. That's Darren, who's now in Australia. That's my son Ryan and his friend Oren Quinn. Keelan Malloy, who's now one of the stars for Antrim. Ronan Malloy in front of him there, the young fella with the blonde hair clapping. My wife I actually saw in the background there. So that is amazing footage. Gregory O'Kane, on the left, who now is obviously our senior manager, who went on to, Gregory's had an amazing career. Gregory's probably in his late 30s then in 2009. But what an impact he had. But Gary and I managed that team. So, yeah, that's really good to see. I didn't know you had that. So,
isn't it fun that the young fellas were there? Your young fella, like, I did recognise him there, and you say Keelan Malloy, and they now are the main men. Yeah.
And I suppose it's days like that sort of it grows a love for the game in young fellas. It's days like that when they see those days, they see what it means to people, and they want to be part of it. You know, I know my young fella from a very early stage just wanted to be part of it, and those days are what attracts them. That's what brings them in. That's what makes them feel that they want to do it themselves. So a lot of that team now would have young fellas who are now involved, who are coming through. Gregory's a couple of young fellas, Alistair's young fellas. You know, so it's sort of and that's what's unique to the GAA. I think that's what's so special about it, is that, you know, you just see it. It's cyclical. You can see the generations coming through from the various families in the club, ourselves, the McMullins, the O'Kanes, you know, those famous names in the club, that Malloys and the young fellas that come through following in their fathers and their grandfathers' footsteps before that. So that's that. Lovely footage. I must get you to send that to me.
Well, take me back then to when you were the little kid watching Antrim or watching Dunloy winning championships or whatever they were doing in those days. You know, when you were like Ryan there, when you were that age, what are your memories or what inspired you?
Well, you see, I come up through an era. It's an interesting question. I come up through an era where we weren't winning championships. We didn't win our first championship until 1990, and when I played, and we'll maybe talk about that. So I came up through an era in the 80s where we really, in the club, we had started to my father, Willie Richmond, Chris Elliott, Aidan McCanfill, Eugene Traynor and people like that had started to put an underage structure in place through the 80s. So from 82 on, we started to build serious underage teams where we really swept the boards, if I'm being honest. There was a year in 84, we won an under 14, we won an under 16, we won a minor in the 1 year. So we won under 21s, 4 or 5, we won 4 or 5 minors. So we started to build through the 80s leading into the 90s. So we had barren spells. We reached a final as a club, and it's my first memory actually. In 76, we reached the final in Rossa, in the old Casement Park, and got well beaten actually. There was a bit of a row at the end. There was people over the wire and everything. And that was my first, and up until that, then we never got back to another final until 1990. We had barren years. That's not to say we hadn't good teams or good players, but it took a number of years through an underage structure and strategy for us to get to inevitably where we ended up in the 90s. So I was probably, my love for the game was through my father's involvement. My father was very involved in the coaching side of things. He was one of the men who took forward that underage structure. So I came at a good time, and I came at a good generation because we had it lucky, as you do sometimes, where you get a number of people coming through at the one time who have a bit of talent and have a bit of drive about them. So that probably was what shaped me through the 80s and then leading into the 90s.
So what was it like when your dad was running that whole youth scheme and you're a young fella there? Was that nice to have him around, or was it a bit embarrassing for a young fella?
No, it was history repeats itself, because I followed my father around a lot of teams. He was involved in underage county teams at that time, and I remember, the young fella around carrying the water, looking up to the guys that was there. And then as that evolved, and I started to be coaching, like as you saw on the footage, then Ryan followed me around. He was at the pitch. He was pucking at the side of the pitch. He was carrying the water. He was sucking it all in. And I can see it now with Gregory, who's in charge of our senior team. His young fella does exactly the same thing. He follows the team around. He's on the bus. He's carrying water. He's part of it. So it really is cyclical. But my father and my uncle Chris actually played in under 1970 intermediate All-Ireland champions team with Antrim. It was a great cornerback. We're really to the fore, along with, as I said, Willie Richmond, Eugene Trainer, Aidan McCanfield, who Aidan and Eugene are no longer with us. And Jimmy McMullen was another one. And those, the time and effort when I look back that they put in, people can forget that now. As you move on to the next generations, people can forget the generations that came before them and how important they were to put the club in the position that it's now in. Like they were there in the 80s. There was another bunch of guys there in the 90s. I was probably there in the 2000s. But it moves on. Everything moves on, and you quickly forget what went before to get you the club that you now are. But we had some good times now.
I'm wondering how they did that, though, if you're saying that there wasn't really any significant success at senior level and the likes of the Ballycastles and Cushendalls had been so strong for decades, and you guys just come along. What did they do?
I think they put a structure in place, Jerome, which was important. I think they realised that unless they started to bring players through, it was never going to change. That old mantra, if you keep doing what you kept doing, you'll keep getting what you kept getting, And so I think they saw that they needed to do something. I think it probably, like you'll see with underage teams in every clubs, they had children of that age. So they had a passion for it. They knew that they needed proper structures. They needed to properly coach. They needed to have professional enough setups as it was in the 80s. We were a very professional setup in the 80s. And they knew that without that, if you hadn't the players coming through that were buying into it in some numbers, because we hadn't great numbers in our senior teams at that time, and they had the vision and the foresight to know that they had to start somewhere, because at that time we weren't competing as a senior team really in any competitive way. We were playing Division 1 league, but we wouldn't even have been that competitive in the league. So they knew that they needed to bring consistency at league level by bringing players through, and they knew, and at the time they knew, I made my debut in 1987 with our senior team as a 17-year-old. So they started to trust young fellas maybe too early. Some people would have said, because we were probably, as a 17-year-old, I was as green as grass, probably wasn't. But they knew they were going to have to take 2 or 3 years of pain and let us learn as a group of young fellas. And that ultimately proved to be right when we actually got across the line in 1990.
I'm wondering though, when they were doing the actual coaching before that, before you were 17 in the earlier years, what were they doing in their actual coaching? You've mentioned that it was professional. What were they actually bringing into the actual coaching of the kids, and how did they get the numbers up?
I think anybody would tell you good coaching is not rocket science, Jerome. And I think what they did well, and I remember it, I do remember it in the 80s, we did the basics and we did them repeatedly. We did them time and time and time again. Sometimes but it was always interesting. To be fair to my father, he was a great coach, and that 2 sessions never really looked the same, even in the 80s. But we focused a lot on first touch. We focused a lot on lifting. We focused an awful lot on hooking and blocking and the basics of the game. And I remember doing drills ad nauseum on those things, maybe 2 to 3 times a week. And we trained 4 times a week. Even as young fellas, even as an under-12 team, I can remember we would have been training 3 times a week. But we just did the basics over and over and over again. And that repetition, and I coach a lot even now, that hasn't changed. Nothing has fundamentally changed. That if you focus on the basics and you get them right, and you have the right players with the right attitude, then success can flow from that.
Right. Let's talk about the success then. When you did break through, and the rest of Antrim must have been a little bit shocked. There must have been, milestones along the way there. You mentioned the first, the Antrim Championship, but actually beating the various teams along the way, there must have been huge steps. I mean, we saw the excitement there from 11 years ago. It must have been incredible back then.
I don't tend to be terribly nostalgic, if I'm being honest. I'm not a great one for looking back, but 1990 was something else, because it was the first championship we had ever won. And you look at 2009, multiply that by 10 and 90 in terms of the emotion that spilled over. There was some footage, there's been a lot of old footage floating about in the lockdown, and there's some footage that it still would bring a tear to my eye watching it. And that 1990, in 1989 we were beaten by Lochgiel in the championship, and beaten well, probably about 12 points down in Cushendall. Remember it well, because Clute McFetridge was playing for Lochgiel at the time, and he was at top of his game. That was the year when Antrim competed in the All-Ireland, obviously. And I remember coming off the field, and it was doom and gloom. The club just felt we're a million miles away. These young guys are not as good as we thought they would be. They're a million miles away from winning a championship. So when we came to 90, nobody really expected us to do what we did. I think none of the top clubs, Rossa, the Lochgiels, the Cushendalls of that time, really treated us that seriously, I don't believe. I thought this bunch of young whippersnappers, once we get them into a championship, we'll rough them up a bit, and we'll ultimately put them away. So we probably came a year or two sooner than what people had thought, given what happened to us in 89. And we actually went through a tough campaign. We beat Cushendall in the preliminary. We beat St. John's in a quarter-final. And we're lucky to get past St. John's in Lochgiel that day. Beat Ballycastle narrowly in a semi-final, with the Donnellys were at the top of their game then. And then went on to beat Rossa in the replay. And Rossa had played in the All-Ireland final the previous year. They were beaten by Buffers Alley, if you remember. Yeah. So that was a really strong, mature, physically, Kieran Barr, Ger Rogan, Jim Fagan, Jim Riley, Colin. They had some really, really good seasoned players, the Murrays, Adrian Murray. So we weren't really expected, and everybody thought we played them in Lochgiel the first day. Went to a draw, which we probably could and should have won. Then everybody thought we'd missed the boat, and then we went back to our favourite ground in the world, actually, to Casement Park, and won an epic encounter there by a goal. I think we beat them by a goal. It was a goal, and the scenes that day were just something to behold. And I think that day has sort of given us we've a real love for the Volunteer Cup in Dunloy, actually. We just have a real passion. If you won the Volunteer Cup, then anything that follows from that really is a bonus. And when we think back to 1990, people still talk about that as the day that really started the club on its current trend. Yeah.
Do you have any particular personal memory yourself at the end of that game, maybe, or with your family, with your dad?
I think it was just the sheer the emotion being swamped, and I just remember being swamped by people. and just getting caught up in the middle of all that. You know, I even still look back at the footage and I can't see myself. I wasn't the biggest, but I was just actually swamped by people. So actually, I can't even remember seeing my father. It might have been the changing rooms before I saw him. I remember distinctly big Seamus Mushy McMullen, who was the captain, on being swept across. It was the only thing I can describe it as crowd surfing, where he was just being swept across in a wave of bodies. You know, it was just incredible to see. And I remember that. And then all I then remember is the sanctuary of the dressing room after that, when you sort of go back to some degree of normality. But I think even looking back, I was 19, 20 at that stage. He probably didn't fully realize just the sheer relief and the emotion that brought to people, because there were grown men crying who had, you know, who thought they were never going to see this day. So it was a very, very special day. And all of our life, you know, even around here today, we still talk about that very fondly.
How did you become a goalkeeper?
It goes back to my primary school days, and our headmaster at the time was Danny McAlonan, and I was in P5, and he took me to a blitz, and I wasn't the biggest child at P5, and he stuck me in goals, and I did all right, and it just grew from there. I liked the position. And I never moved out of it. I played a bit outfield through underage and used to come out and play the odd time out the field. But I suppose that's where it dates back to P5. And I remember the first game because it was in the old pitch down in Cushendall at primary school. And I haven't a great memory for then, but I do distinctly remember that.
And did your father encourage you to stay in goals?
And so he didn't discourage it. He didn't discourage it, so that was probably encouragement on his on his back. The fact that he didn't say, no, we need to get you out of there. You know, I think they realised at an early stage, and again, I see this underage level even now, they still make the mistake of get your best players out the field, and that is far from always the case. You know, your best forward on a good day might score 2 or 3 goals. On a very good day, a poor goalkeeper on a bad day could let in 2 or 3 very easily. So I think they realised at that stage that it was a position not to be ignored, and not to, you know, a bit like the old Brazils, get all your best players out and just score more goals than everybody else. They realised, look, if we're going to come through, we need to have a goalkeeper as much as we need to have a star forward. So to give them credit, they probably realised that from an early age. So I didn't mind the position, so I stuck with it.
I presume you were at the 1989 All-Ireland final and maybe even the semi-final, and I presume you had an eye on Niall Patterson, the goalkeeper, and you watched him?
I did. I was a great fan of Niall's, actually. I was in the Hill in 1989 is where I watched the match. And as a 19-year-old, Niall was a keeper I always looked up to. Growing up through the 80s, you know, he was the man in the Antrim #1 jersey. He had a great hand, massive puck out. I always just admired his puck out, you know, because just the length he could get into his puck outs, and his nimbleness on his feet for a big man. So yeah, Niall was a keeper I always had a lot of time and respect for. And what I always remember about Niall was the gentleman that he was, and I mean that because I remember I made my debut, and I said when I was 17-year-old, and it was against Lougheed. And if you're familiar with Dunloy and Lougheed matches, they can be edgy, they can be touchy, they have a real rivalry there. And I remember my debut was against Lougheed in Dunloy, and I did all right. A 17-year-old, I did all right. And I remember after the match in our changing rooms, because I didn't get to see Niall after the match, he came into the changing room. He came into the Dunloy changing room to shake my hand, to say well done. Which was a brave man, absolutely, to come into our change after the game. We had actually won the game, and we didn't often beat Lougheed at that time. And I just thought, I've never forgotten that as a 17-year-old, just the gentleman that Niall was, and what a great keeper he was.
You mentioned his puck out. I remember Antrim played Cork and Croke Park in an All-Ireland semi-final around then. And Cork just scored a goal, and he lifted a ball, whether it was the same ball, and pucked it straight to Kieran Barr, who put it straight in the net at the other end. Yeah. And I don't think it's ever been seen on TV. I was at the game because in those days RT only had a couple of cameras. That's and right, yeah. They didn't expect it, but he hit it so far and so hard that we got a goal at the other end right away from him.
Yeah.
So a lot of people, have fond memories of watching Big Niall, and he was a fantastic keeper. He really was,
He was, and just a nice fella, to be perfectly honest, and when I was actually come on to the Antrim County panel in '90 as deputy, the year after they were in the All-Ireland final. And Niall was, obviously I wasn't going to really push Niall that seriously at that time, because he was well established, but he couldn't have been nicer in terms of, being supportive, welcoming you onto the panel, asking you stuff, teaching you stuff, so he really, so he's a guy I would have a lot of time for, actually.
So then that takes us on to your Antrim career. Sorry, we're a bit of interference here, but we'll persist. Your Antrim career, then you came in on the back of '89, really?
I came in on the back of '89, so I probably, I came in '90 as deputy to Niall, and was there for a year or two. Played the odd game here or there. Niall was still very much the man in control for those couple of years. And then I slipped away a bit, if I'm being honest, because I was finishing at university and there was a lot, and so the problem, and anybody who's been there will know that being a sub goalkeeper is one of the hardest positions to be in any team. You need enormous, incredible patience. You need to, it's hard to get in there. I was never really going to get in there with Niall. That was, I had long since accepted that. So I wasn't in any way resentful of that at all. But I was final year at university. I was approaching my final years, and I just had other priorities. So I was there for a couple of years at that time, and then slipped away, and then I came back 2 or 3 years again after that. So the early '90s weren't probably my best Antrim years. It probably was closer to the mid '90s, and because Paddy Gallagher then came along, Big Pat Gallagher from St John's, and when it came along and was another great keeper, and then Pat went to America. So it was really after that I started to get more involved.
Well, move on to the good bits then. What were your highlights from playing with Antrim?
I probably if I'm being honest, my greatest highlights were from playing club during the '90s. I had some great times with
that, and I'll come on to that.
No. I had some great times playing with Antrim, and played with some of the best characters who you would still have the crack with. We won a few Ulster titles that year. We had some absolute humdingers of battles with there was a great down team at that stage. In the early to mid '90s, there was a great down team that we had. That you can watch the footage and you see. Maybe close on 10,000 people in Casement Park watching Ulster finals. So, and those battles were absolutely, and some of them were really tough, and Down won a couple of them. So I was involved in a couple of defeats in Ulster finals. I also won 3 or 4. Also, and then towards the late '90s, we had the battle seemed to shift between Antrim and Derry. Derry had a great setup at that time, had a very, very strong outfit. You had the likes of Ollie Collins, you had the likes of Big Jeffrey McGonigal. They had some great, Collie McGurk. They had some great players at that time. They turned us over in '98, I think it was. But they were great games, absolutely great games. So probably my best memories of Antrim were the sort of mid '90s when we were successful. We went on then to compete, and you went straight to an All-Ireland quarter-final at that stage. So we played in a few of those in Croke. So it was always good to get playing in Croke Park. We played the Offaly team that won a couple of All-Irelands, beat us in a couple of those occasions. We had the Brian Whelans, the Michael Dignans, some of the Offaly greats around that. They were winning a couple of titles in the '90s. So whilst we didn't break a lot of delf in the All-Ireland stage in the same way that the team of the late '80s, early '90s did, we still had some great days, but we shifted a couple of heavy beatings, if we're being honest, that probably felt we didn't do ourselves justice when we got to the All-Ireland quarterfinals. And that's probably a regret. You look back on that and you think we could probably done an awful lot better than we did. But we were playing the top teams. That was the Offaly were winning All Irelands. Limerick were competing strongly there. Kilkenny beat in the early '90s. So some great days. We played with some great characters, and winning the Ulster was seen as a bit of an achievement. Then it's probably lost a lot. It's lost an awful lot of its gloss now. An Ulster title now is, well, sure, they don't play for it now, and over the years previous to that, it had become relatively meaningless. But in the 90s, it did mean something.
I'm sort of trying to get at your personal memories. I mean, you've given me a good resume there of what happened at county level and what Antrim did, but I'm trying to get into your head and your best day in Croke Park, or your best moments that you really look back, and have you any special memories?
Well, you always playing at Croke Park generally is special. I think even the just the whole the surroundings and everything that goes with it. So the Antrim, the times I played with Antrim, and I don't have great memories, if I'm being honest, in Croke, because we ended up at the wrong side of 10-point defeats, 15-point defeats. So you don't tend to dwell on those too much. One of them I probably played pretty well in, the other not so well. So the one that I play well in, I have no fonder memories of it than I do of the one that you tend to, well, we ended up getting beaten quite heavily. So it's something you want to move on from quite quickly. And I, even with all of those games, and that's what I said to you earlier, I'm not terribly nostalgic. I've never watched any games back that I played in, even the ones that I knew I played well, and certainly not the ones that I knew I didn't play so well. So I've never really looked back and dwelt too much on past performances. But if I was to pick out a standout moment, it's probably a goal that was scored against me, if I'm being honest. Was John Troy scored one of the greatest goals. It's still showing, it's still put up there sometimes, and that's when I see myself picking the ball out of the back of the net. But it was a goal that John Troy scored against me, where he did something. He sort of slapped his stick down, pulled the ball into his hand, threw it and stuck it past me. That I never really seen it. So that, and you look back and you think that's just greatness. John Troy was one of the greatest stick artists you would ever see. So you look back at that and you think that was, so it wasn't a save, or I don't have thinking of any. I had a decent enough game that day. It was, but that goal stands out for me. But it was one that I conceded as opposed to one that I stopped. Yeah.
You must have come across Davy Fitz in those days, and a lot of those lads. What memories do you have of people like that?
Yeah, no, yeah, we knew Davy Fitz. No Davy Fitz. Played, played National League. When he was goalkeeper for Clare. Played in an All-Ireland club. They beat us in an All-Ireland club final, 6 Mile Bridge, in '96. So I got to know
you in a way, Shane. He'd be a smallish guy, but
he was smallish, yeah.
Reactions, and obviously we've seen since, we know what sort of character he is now, and he was in that fantastic Clare team as well. So I'm wondering what sort of bond you two had.
Yeah, I got on well with Davy. Always did. Still would know him. He would be very. He's quite a close affiliation with the club. He's very friendly with Big Mushy McMullen here, that I know well. Still would be in touch. So you see him up around here every so often. So I've always had a lot of time for Davy. As a character, he was probably a bit fiery than I was. He certainly was very passionate. He was an extremely good goalkeeper. And I remember, in the mid-90s when they beat us in the All-Ireland, him making time to come and seek me out after them. And you always remember things like that, because in the midst of having just won an All-Ireland, that he still took the time to find you and console you and everything else. And then we played Clare a few times in the National League through the 90s. So I just got to know him since that. So it's great to see him doing as well as he has. And you still see his passion burning to this day. That's his standout characteristic. He's a fiery character. He's got that sort of small man syndrome, hasn't he? Where he'll stick the chest out. No, not to the same degree. No, I know my limitations. I know when to stick my chest out and when to stick it back in again, Jerome.
And those were the days when you didn't wear a helmet. You got out before you had to wear a helmet.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely, and there'd be very few. These wouldn't be my own teeth. There'd be very few. The scars and everything. I would have struggled to, because I grew up not wearing a helmet. So I think what the GAA did they did well in terms of phasing it in at underage level, bringing it through to senior level, because if you're not accustomed to wearing it, it's very, very difficult. So those were the days that we didn't wear a helmet. And I suppose the thing about that is that I think a lot of the players of my day were more recognisable sometimes than they are now. I think the thing about the helmets is, whilst they're great and they certainly have improved the game, you sort of lose the personalities. You don't, some of the top players people may not even recognise if they saw them without their helmet on. That wasn't the case when you knew what the top players looked like. So
Sambo.
Sambo. Well, Sambo probably should have worn a helmet.
You have an image, obviously, he was very distinctive with the bald head, and even have an image when I think of him, it's probably blood coming from somewhere as well.
Yeah, and that's exactly, and those are the images you have without the helmet. And I think, well, helmets, whilst they're great protection, I think they've also brought on the high fielding side of the game. I think they've developed the game in the air where people know they can go up with confidence. Whereas you were going up and there was a whole lot more when I played, certainly, of pulling the ball in the air, doubling it on, where now it's much more about possession and trying to catch the ball as opposed to batting it or drawing it on. And when you had no helmet on with people drawing around you, you needed to be more careful. But it was a great initiative, and I think
one on silent as well.
I've just done that there. That must be my mother looking at me. I can't imagine who else that would be.
That's Stevie Fitz.
Yeah.
Or you know who it might be? Another friend of yours that people, you were telling me before that people mightn't know, but you're a big friend of Michael O'Neill, the now former Northern Ireland manager. How did that come about, and how close are you?
I'd be very friendly with Michael. Michael's or Mickey, as I call him, we went to school together. We were the same year at school, so right up through St. Louis and Ballymena, Mickey and I would have been quite close, so we've always stayed in touch. My wife, I keep him going to this day that he met his wife through me. My wife and his wife would be very friendly. So we'd be in regular enough contact. We meet up when he's home, keep in touch through WhatsApp, text, and whatever else. So yeah, Michael and I would be pretty friendly, and it's interesting because it gives you an insight to that sort of professional side of sport and what that professional side is like, in terms of how they prepare, in terms of how the sort of detail they go into in their preparation, and there's a lot I think we can learn and have learned from how professional sports manage. But yeah, we're still good friends.
I take it what you're saying is that you've been over to some games where he's been in charge and you've seen what's going on. What experiences did you have there? How close did you get to the setups to see what it's like?
When he was with Shamrock Rovers, I went down a few times to Shamrock Rovers, and I remember watching their sessions, and he took me through, and then he moved from there to Northern Ireland. And I remember, the stuff he would have shown you on the computers about game analysis and watching players and the notes they would have given to players and the likes. Hadn't been to very many Northern Ireland matches. When I went to the Northern Ireland match. You might remember they made a play about it one night in November. And I was at that match because Mickey was on the squad. And I was sitting beside Michael's father that night. Des, who incidentally, his father was a good hurler, a very good hurler. His father played for Antrim and Ulster in the 50s into the 60s. And Des, I still laugh about it now. If when we meet up, Des would rather talk to me about hurling than he would talk to Michael about football. He's just a passionate hurling man, knows a lot about it. And I was sitting beside Des that night in '88. And it was round, the Troubles was really bad at the time. Not long after Grey Steel and all of that stuff that was going on.
94 or 93?
Right? It was whatever, was it?
The one where...
It was 93. It was the one they made the play about it one night in November. It was the one that the Republic were qualifying for the World Cup.
McLaughlin's goal.
That's the very one. Alan McLaughlin scored the goal. Billy Bingham was in charge of Northern Ireland. And I was at that game sitting beside Michael's father, and I vowed I have no interest in ever going back to another game. It was horrible stuff, is the only way I could put it, and didn't really go back for it. And then when Michael took charge, it's very different, but I never really, and I wish probably I had. But he's now at Stoke, as you know. He's at Stoke, really loving it over there, fully embracing the club scene.
Did he go along to any of your games? Did he go? Did he have any interest in hurling from his father, or did he play any at school, for example?
He did. He did. He played. He played a bit. It was extremely quick. Stick work would have been a bit rougher, but he was so fast, and that he had the pace to get away from players. So he was decent. If he'd played the game, he would have absolutely been decent if he'd have practiced. Very good Gaelic footballer. He was a very, very good Gaelic footballer, actually. But then he left school in his 6th year to go to Newcastle at that time, and that was the end of any GAA career he might have had. Yeah.
Oh, well, that brings me sort of a segue onto your top 15, your best players that you've seen. I take it Michael doesn't quite make it, but you're talking there about some really good players, and his father Des. By the way, what club was his father Des?
St Gall's.
Oh,
St Gall's, man. St Gall's in Belfast. He actually came originally from Portadown, his father, and then he played for St Gall's. But he played for Antrim and Ulster. And he was a goalkeeper. So he was always very interested. Des would have been very interested in my career and how Dunloy were going and how Antrim were going.
You're the son he never had, the goalkeeper.
I probably, I would keep him going a bit about that. Your dad would prefer to talk to me than he would to you. So we'd still laugh about that even now. Yeah.
Right. Let's go on to your Antrim 15. The best hurlers that you've seen and played with from Antrim, and the most interesting one's probably the first one because you are a goalkeeper. So, who's your goalkeeper?
Well, it's a man we talked about, if I'm being honest, Benile Patterson. Just for all the reasons I talked about earlier, and the fact that he's such a gentleman. But Niall was a really good goalkeeper, and the one that through the 80s I'd have looked up to and watched and thought, yeah, and he had it all, and particularly his puck outs, which were so strong. Notable mention: Pat Gallagher, who followed him, was a very, very good goalkeeper. Pat, massive puck out. Went to America. He could have been there for a long time. But I remember playing St John's in the '90 championship when we beat them in the quarter final, and there was a strong breeze in Lough and Pat was pucking the ball wide. Probably to his own team's detriment, if I'm being honest. And you could see the frustration and hear the frustration of the full forward line. But Pat was capable of pucking the ball wide at that time, So and was a real character. The right cornerback. Well, I've used a bit of poetic license here, Jerome, because I've just went with 6 backs, a bit like they picked the All Irelands, because instead of a right cornerback, a full back, and I've picked my 6 best backs, and we'll put them in where we think. My first is a clubmate of mine, so I don't want to be accused of bias, but he's nailed on cert. I don't think anybody in Antrim would be Gary O'Kane. And Gary was our centre half, both at club and county, for a number of years, and probably the best reader of a game I've ever watched. Gareth, you talk about your centre half playing like a pendulum across the line. Gary just had that to a T, and his reading of the game was second to none. And he was never afraid to receive the ball, ever, no matter what pressure you were under, no matter what was going on around you. He wanted the ball. So Gary would be my first. Second would be a man who's no longer with us, actually, James McNaughton, who played in that great '89 team. James was a Rolls Royce of a halfback. He was fast, he was tough, and he could distribute the ball extremely well. So sadly, James is no longer, and he was an absolute gentleman too. Sadly, he's no longer with us. But what a great halfback he was, a great player. I'm sticking with '89 for now, but I'll come back. There are a couple of younger guns, but Woody McKinley would be another one. Dominic Woody McKinley. Over the years, Dominic played for Antrim for a number of years. He managed me when I played. When I came onto the panel at the tail end. He was probably at the tail end of his career, so I didn't get playing with him for any great length. But Woody, whose son now plays for Dunloy, incidentally, Connor McKinley. But Dominic was hard as nails and a great player. Aaron Graffin would be my next one of the more modern day in the last 10, 15 years. Aaron is as reliable as he has come through a couple of nasty injuries through the years and bounced back, and so a real leader of men. So Aaron, sticky cornerback. One who didn't play as long as I would like to have seen him playing, but it would have been, I think he would have on to be one of the best fullbacks in Ireland, with Cormac Hippie Donnelly of Ballycastle, who had to retire in his mid-20s. But certainly, you know, he had a year or two before that where he was excelled as a fullback. He really was a talent, Cormac. Went on to coach Slaughtneil alongside Mickey McShane. But Cormac was a hell of a player. So I would definitely have him in my. And his father played on the '89 team, a great fullback himself. So I would have had Cormac in there. And then lastly, I would be Sambo, Terence McNaughton. Sambo, over the years, you know, for Antrim was a stalwart. And during my time in the 90s, I always got on very well with him, always had a lot of time for him. And he would have made time for you. You know, he was that sort of character. Great storyteller. A lot of it lies, but he would be a great storyteller. But Sambo would have to be in there. He'd been in most people's 15. And still very involved in the game. He went on to manage the county for a long time as well. So, yeah.
So I'm a little bit surprised that storytelling gets you into this team, but I'll give you that poetic license. But also a little bit surprised Sambo. Some people would put him in midfield, but you know that brings me on to your midfield.
I should say there's a couple of notable mentions there, you know, because I'm never a great fan of these things, because you always leave out people. You don't want to offend people, and you leave out people you thought, oh, what about him?
Trying to get
you know, the likes
off the hook here.
Yeah, well, a wee bit. I'm sitting there, yeah, you know, because the likes of Desi Donnelly, who won an All-Star, I have admitted, you know, the likes of Johnny Campbell, Big Mushy, Aidan McAteer, people like that, great defenders, who aren't in there. But I suppose it's all about opinion.
But then people who didn't even make your backup list are going to be even more annoyed.
Absolutely. Well, I will not even go there. We could be here all day.
Absolutely. Yeah, midfield then.
Midfield. Well, I think there's one obvious. Paul McKillen, Humpy McKillen. Paul was, for club and county, you know, and right through my time playing, Paul was an ever-present at both county and club level. Many a battle we had against him for the club, and many a time with the county. But Paul was a great midfielder. Played it very simply, moved the ball on. There was nothing too fancy, but he was some hurler. Could take a score from middle of the field, could distribute the ball, and was tough. Alongside him, I have Jim Conley of Rossa. Jim, who I would have played with. Jim had a great hand. Was never afraid to show for the ball. Again, you know players that want the ball, and you're standing as a goalkeeper looking to who to puck it out. Jim stuck his hand up whether he was in the right position or not. He always wanted the ball, and had a great hand and could use the ball very well. So Paul and Jim alongside each other in midfield. I should say from the outset, this is probably from the 90s onwards. I'm conscious of teams and the players that went before Jerome that I didn't see so much of. So it's
That's
probably
okay.
The ones.
Your dad and Des O'Neill will not be too offended. It's all right.
No,
more or less with players that you played with or played against. So that's fine.
Yes.
You mentioned Jim Conley. I seem to remember Jim playing a wee bit with a 14 on his back as well. So, but yeah, great midfielder. But go into the forwards for me now then. Well,
the forwards were difficult, and I've got Neil McManus would be in there. Neil, I think over the last 10 years has just been consistently performing well. He gives everything for the. He's obviously passionate about the county. He's passionate about his hurling, so Neil had to be in there. Alistair Elliott, my cousin Alistair, was nailed on cert. Alistair, for me, and I'd be biased, is probably the best forward to come out of Ulster, I think, in the last whatever number of years, and was a real threat at corner forward. And I don't think I'd be accused of bias, because there'd be very few Antrim men, I think, would argue with Alistair being in that 15. We also have Liam Watson. I thought about this one. Liam dipped in and out of the Antrim scene a bit for different reasons, but I think it would have been wrong not to have him in there. Liam was an exceptional talent, and it probably was a bit of a pity he didn't play for Antrim as consistently over the years as he could have and was more than capable of. But yeah, I think if I'm looking at a 15 in terms of hurling ability, Liam has to be in there. The other one would be Alton McFetridge, Clute, who for me was just, second to Alistair. Clute had just something about him that very few have. He's one of those guys that just had it. He had a touch and an ability and a Tommy Walsh-like ability to field high ball above people that he should never have been fielding it above. His timing was just exceptional, and a great humble character. So Clute, I think, would definitely be in there.
There's a lovely quote that you gave a while back about DJ Carey, but it applies to Clute as well. He said the only bad ball into a forward is no ball at all. And especially that Offaly game in '89, the semi-final, there was balls coming into Clute and you thought, well, 50-50 at best, and he managed to conjure a score from it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Clute didn't care what way it came in. And he certainly wouldn't have been one for giving off. He was a quiet fellow on the pitch, but great character off it. He wasn't one for ripping and roaring, but by God, when you delivered the ball into his area, you knew there was something going to happen, and inevitably. And him and Alistair were like that. When the chips were down and you needed somebody to win you a ball and do something with it, they were the two players that were more than capable of that. Whereas now, I think, the forwards want the ball played in front of them. They want it played into areas. They want it, and then they give off if they're not getting it where they want it to. Whereas, the likes of Alistair and Clute just get it into me and I'll see how I get on with it. So Clute's in there. Kieran Barr. I think I played again. Yeah, Kieran was in that Rossa team that we beat in 1990. But he was just a beast. He was a beast of a man, and what a hand! He had a great hand, and he sort of epitomised that '89 team, just strength and sheer ability. And he could hurl. He absolutely could hurl, but he had upper body strength that very few have, and was just able to position himself to move boys out of the way and catch the ball. So I've got Kieran in there.
And he had great self-confidence too. He went forward to Croke Park and it was like, we can do this, we're going down there. He put his chest out and he was very articulate.
That's right. And actually went on to be one of the presenters on the Sunday game. He was very articulate, and you still hear him speak now, Kieran. Very intelligent, articulate guy. But he led that '89 team extremely well. So I think he deserves to be in there. And my last shout is, again, my own clubmate, and I couldn't, it was Paul Shields. And I think there's very few people watching would think, no, Paul Shields is just, as I described James McNaughton as a bit of a Rolls Royce. Paul was a Rolls Royce. He just made the game look easy. Glides over the ground, always seems to be in space, and that's what good players do. They make it look easy. And Paul certainly would be of that calibre. He, for club and county, and he represented Antrim. He was passionate about Antrim, really passionate about Antrim in his playing days, and probably didn't want to go when he did because there was a year or two in him, but he knew that his legs couldn't continue to carry him at both county and club level. So he took the decision that he wanted to get more out of his club career, and we have saw the advantage of that. We have absolutely saw the advantage of that. The one I will say that I do want to say that would be, again, another clubmate of mine who was so close to being there, and I thought I might have been pushing it, would be Gregory O'Kane, who was Gregory was a great full forward.
You're in trouble now, man.
Great ball one, but sure, like you put me in this position, Jerome, so I'll be blaming you. But I think
what other honourable mentions are there then? Have you anyone else you need to mention?
Well, you had the likes of Brian Donnelly, who was a great, again, those '89 forwards, Aidan McCarry, Beaver McCarry, those guys that I played against. Brian McFall from St John's was a great player. Johnny McIntosh was a great servant for Antrim from Glenariff. Our own Paddy Richmond, those guys, those very talented and highly talented players. But I suppose you asked me to pick 15, but that's the best I could do.
And obviously, to get you off the hook as well, the current crop, like your son, couldn't be considered just yet, obviously. But
No.
as his career goes on, but isn't it nice that your son is playing there, Stephen? And you were telling me, or Ryan, and you were telling me that Stephen, Noel Keith's son, is playing in goals as well, who'd been a big friend of yours as well. It must be lovely for you to have that. And you talked earlier about your dad bringing you through, and now, you know, the continuity is there.
Yeah, and you can see it. It is cyclical. It's straight. Yeah, because Ryan and he didn't go into goals because of me. Far from it. I didn't encourage him. He sort of gravitated towards it, and we didn't discourage it. Again, we recognised when we were doing underage the importance of having a sound base. And it's just interesting to see, because you talk about Noel Keith and you talk about, you know, the goal. For me, Noel was just one of, I really had a lot of time, admired Noel Keith from Ballycran and down. I thought he was one of the best keepers in Ireland. He just had everything about him. And you can see his son now keeping goals for Down, Stephen, another a really good goalkeeper and a sound lad too. So like father, like son, he's a gentleman of, you know, if you meet him off the field. So these things tend to pass on.
And your son then, as you say, he gravitated, that's a nice way of putting it, into goals. So I'm wondering at that point, for you looking on, seeing him going into goals, and you're not pushing him to go in, but he's obviously heard that you're a goalkeeper and seen you playing once or twice. And I'm wondering, as a dad, were you looking at him going into goals and thinking, that's my boy?
There's probably an element of, yeah, there's maybe an element of that. You know, there was part of me thought of, nah, stay out of there, you know, because you'll have the comparisons with the father, probably more good where there's a lot of pressure there following stepping into a position that your father would have played, and those comparisons that would inevitably come. And I understand the pressures of the role. It's a lonely enough position. It's a very lonely position when it's not going well, as every goalkeeper will tell you, and we've all been in situations where it hasn't gone well. It's a very, very lonely position. So that worried me a bit, if I'm being honest, because I know what that can feel like. And but the fact that he wanted to do it was key. I think that is a secret at underage level too, is finding someone who wants to do it. Because if they don't want to do it, then you're going to struggle to keep encouraging them to do it. But thankfully, he wanted to do it. He showed at an early age he was capable of doing it, and that made it a wee bit easier.
Yeah, your children find their own way, you know.
Yeah.
You can encourage a little bit, but obviously you wanted to do it. On another issue, you mentioned a few times your fondness for Casement Park. And we've talked about the old Casement. We're still waiting for the new Casement. I take it, you know, you're obviously disappointed like the rest of us about what's happened there. It seems to be agonisingly close to coming about, but how important do you see that to the future of Antrim GAA and indeed to hurling in Antrim, to have that opened up in a key focal point stadium there?
Yeah, it's absolutely critical, Jerome, if I'm being honest. My fondest days on the game were from Casement Park. It genuinely was my favourite ground in the country. Croke Park included. We loved Casement Park. It just had something about it. The surface, the atmosphere it could generate, it was just a place that brings back a lot of happy memories. So it's sad to see it in the decline that it's in. I think it's been a shambles in terms of the fact that it's got to this position, and I don't know the politics of it or how it has come to that, but how it was shut down before it was all sorted out, I just can't get my head around, to be honest. So clearly there was big mistakes made, but I think in terms of the game going forward, from an Antrim perspective, it's critical to have a home, to have somewhere that we can aspire for young fellas to want to play in, you know, because at the moment it's so nomadic, you know, you don't know when a county game's going or where a county games are going to be. They're moving around Dunloy, Ballycastle, Lochgiel. The last one was in Portlanone. You know, so we need a base and we need somewhere that young fellas will aspire to play in. And I think to get Casement up and running can only be a good thing for Antrim and Ulster hurling, if I'm being honest. So the sooner that happens, the better. And, you know, as I say, I think the whole thing's been a bit shambolic to leave it in the condition that it now is.
Your Gaelic Life columns have been very popular, and you've been very consistent in what you've been saying there through the lockdown. And you said the July 20 date is critical, and there's no point having glorified challenge games. So, and a contact game like hurling, really it's hard to do that, and obviously with social distancing and all that sort of stuff. So you've come out with a lot of thoughts on that. I'm wondering now, though, those are sort of articles over the last few months, and it changes so quickly. But I'm wondering now what you think this week of the announcement of the roadmap, if you like, for hurling and for GAA and clubs to come back. Do you think they're doing the right thing?
I think they are, absolutely, Jerome. I think and I have been in the column. I've talked a lot about how well I think the GAA have played this up until this point. I think they've shown great leadership and with the early lockdown and everything else. I think the roadmap was necessary, and the time for it to come. People are now starting to get edgy. People are starting to think, what's happening? Are we playing? Are we not? So I think they've laid it out very, very well, very clearly. And I always, even before that announcement, I thought that 20th of July date was going to be a critical date if we're in a position. What I'm struggling with, and I still haven't seen or heard anything that tells me any different, what I'm struggling with is, if social distancing continues to be a thing for society, how can we play contact sport safely? I can't get my head around that. And I know they're looking at studies of how many times you come into close contact and everything else, which to me, look, if social distance is going to be a thing, how can we put players in a position where they will be continually and consistently in close proximity to each other? So that, I don't think the GAA have even got that yet. I think they need it to produce a roadmap, but I think they're struggling. I could hear John Horan in his last couple of interviews is clearly struggling with it. That scientific group, the advisory group that he set up, I don't think they have the answer yet. I hope they found the answer by the 20th of July, because I think we do need some certainty in the calendar that, yes, it's going to happen, because we can't keep kicking the can down the road. I don't think it's fair to players to keep thinking, aiming for a date and then kicking it on, aiming for a date and kicking it on, because players are trying to train and prepare, and you need to know what you're training and preparing for and when that is, and management need to know when that is to have players in the right shape to play. So I welcome it, but there's still a whole lot of unknowns, I think. The only thing I will say is I'm a lot more positive now than I would have been a month or 3 or 4 weeks ago. I thought 3 or 4 weeks ago we wouldn't see any action this year at all. Genuinely, I thought that. But now I'm a lot more positive than I would have been, and the roadmap has probably helped that positivity. Okay.
Good to hear. To finish on positivity, I have one more question for you, and I don't know if it's going to be totally positive or not, but that's okay. There was a talking point recently about a Team Ulster idea, and I'm wondering where you stand on that, and I'm imagining where you do stand on that. And it was all about putting a debate out there, not just about a Team Ulster idea, but Ulster hurling and where Ulster hurling is and how it is perceived and how things can be changed to help it be perceived. And again, going back to your Gaelic Life columns, there was a comment or two you made about the attitude from some people when you go on your travels outside Ulster about keeping the game going up there. And what was the other? There was one nice comment from somebody in Tipperary who was surprised that the Ulster boys could strike off both sides and everything, Mm-hmm. But I'm wondering from just an Ulster and Antrim point of view, I mean, one of the arguments, I know Antrim is a very proud county, and I'm sure you're a very proud Antrim hurling man, that you don't want to necessarily bring in people from another county. It's like we can do it ourselves. And Antrim is going well at the moment. But could I put it to you in this sort of angle? Imagine Antrim at the moment, they're maybe on the verge of some sort of a breakthrough. If they were also then handed a Chrissy McCaig and a Brendan Rodgers and a few players like that, it wouldn't be Antrim. But at the same time, boy, there'd be some team.
Yeah, and I loved your piece on it, by the way, Jerome. I did. I thought it was great, and you had some people in the game that I would totally respect their opinion on. A lot of them, I would totally respect. If I'm being honest, and I don't want this to come across as Antrim arrogance, because I think we do get accused of this in the whole Team Ulster debate. I think the idea of it is more appealing than the reality of it, is how I would see it. I do like to the idea, but I would need to know logistically how's that going to work. I haven't heard that properly yet. I've heard a lot of opinion and thinking, it would be great to have Team Ulster and be competitive, but how that works, I'm struggling with, because you named Chrissy McCaig and Brendan Rodgers, two exceptional players. Rodgers I coached when I was with Derry, one of the loveliest fellas you would ever meet and a real talent. I struggle to see how they would play for Team Ulster when they don't really play for Team Derry, because they are affiliated. They're footballers. Rory Gallagher's would struggle to release them to play for Derry. So I struggle to see how they could play for Team Ulster and not be playing for Derry. And I struggle to see how the likes of Armagh, Donegal players, what happens to, do they continue, and are they able to continue to compete in the Nicky Rackard? Are they able to continue to play in the Christie Ring if they've released their players to Team Ulster? We work on a fixtures calendar that we know logistically is a nightmare to get everything in that we need to get in. So if we add in Team Ulster, and we have to remember and bear in mind that Ulster's still predominantly a football county or football province, and the counties are still predominantly football focused. That's just the reality. You go to Armagh, you go to Down, you go to Derry, they primarily are football focused. So how they would find the time in their calendar to release their players to play at that top level, I struggle with that. So whilst I do appreciate and like the idea of it and think there might be something in it, I think I would like to hear more detail of what it would look like and who would be allowed to play, who would be released to play. Because there's no point in talking about Derry players playing on it when the reality is they're highly unlikely to play for it because of their other commitments, both football, club, hurling commitments, county, whatever. So it's I just think it would need to be mapped or beefed out a bit more. I don't see a hunger for it in Antrim, if I'm being honest. I know Eddie McCluskey was on, and Eddie's a guy I had a lot of time for, who felt that it's worth exploring. I agree with that. I totally agree it's worth exploring. And then once we have all the facts of what it would look like, you can make a decision on it. So I wouldn't rule out a discussion. I think there should be a discussion and there should be further debate about it. Personally, I would just take a wee bit of convincing that it's actually doable.
Okay, listen, I appreciate all your opinions. You have a lot of great opinions and you put your arguments over really well, which is why you're a columnist in the Gaelic Life and it's very popular. So well done on that. And thanks very much for the interview today. I'm sure a lot of people will get a lot out of it. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of people delighted to get on your 15 and a lot of people not so happy that they didn't get on your 15. But that's where it is. So listen, thanks very much, Shane.
Jerome, thanks. Appreciate that. Thank you. Cheers.